Welcome back, everybody. In this recording, we're going to be exploring another very popular topic within today's personality psychology, something that we call trait theories. Before we get into the specifics of trait theories and some of the more prominent ideas that trait theorists use today, I do want to first give us some context around how this idea of traits fits into the grand scheme of personality psychology. So if you remember back to our last class, we spent a lot of time talking about how personality psychology transitioned from the early theories of Freud, Jung, and more prominent, more personality theorists than anything, to the social cognitive approach to personality and other more research-oriented ideas. Well, this transition to trying to look at personality from a scientific perspective was on occasion focused on what caused personality to emerge, but in times it did start to also look at how personality and individual differences really led to different behaviors in different situations. This different take on the scientific approach to personality psychology is what trait psychologists look at and what we're going to be examining today. It's really important here to kind of highlight the substantial difference between social cognitive theorists and trait theorists. There's definitely some very important things that social cognitive theorists can give us a better sense of when we talk about where personality is coming from and how these things can manifest themselves in different situations. But when we look at the definition of personality psychology, what we see is something that's really missing from a lot of the early ideas that personality psychologists tended to focus their attention on. If we're talking about personality, we're looking at the consistencies within you that make you unique from other individuals. In particular, we're really talking about these things that we call traits, these distinguishing characteristics that you possess that should theoretically carry over across situations and over time. But if you think about what personality researchers have focused on, very rarely have they just narrowed their attention on these traits. They might have tried to understand where these individual differences were arising, how traits started to manifest themselves, but there weren't a lot of people that were saying, let's just study traits for what they are. Let's just look at ways to describe individuals and use that to do things like, say, predict how you're going to react to a specific situation or how you might be optimally prepared for certain environments based on certain characteristics that you have within you. And this new idea, this focus, is what trait psychologists looked at and what gave us kind of a new wrinkle to personality psychology as a whole. Now, to understand where this trait approach began, we actually have to go back almost a century ago to the work of a very kind of uncelebrated theorist that shaped personality psychology today, a gentleman named Gordon Allport. Just so we can understand where Allport was coming from, know that he was born in a small-ish town called Montezuma, Indiana. He was actually the youngest of four children, and all of the members of his family were very academically oriented and also pretty darn successful. In fact, one of his brothers was a visiting professor at UC Berkeley in, I believe it was philosophy, but it might have been psychology as well. Gordon Allport himself attended Harvard for his undergraduate degree and actually ended up, after he was done there, earning a double major in philosophy and economics in 1919. And this led him, like many academics in the early 1900s, to then travel abroad and start teaching and looking into other career opportunities that could be pursued after he earned his undergraduate degree. And he actually taught, for his purposes, at a year in Roberts College in Istanbul, which was kind of a new learning experience. And many people came to conclude that This branching out also gave him the opportunity to start thinking about graduate degrees and studying in Europe, where he could potentially try to master a specific craft and bring it back to the States afterward. One of the avenues that he actually went down and started to think about pursuing was getting into this new and upcoming thing called the psychodynamic approach to personality that had been championed by Sigmund Freud for about a decade when Allport started thinking about his options. And like many aspiring psychologists at the time, Allport didn't really have the option of just studying the psychodynamic approach in the United States. Instead, he was compelled to try to get into Freud's very famous Psychodynamic Institute in Austria and see if there was a way that he could add to the story of this psychodynamic approach and potentially bring these ideas back to the East Coast or maybe West Coast even at some point in his career. And what most reports suggest is that when Allport tried to get into the Psychodynamic Institute, he had a lot of things going for him. He had a pretty good academic pedigree, he had lots of experience, and he seemed to be capable of doing international work and finding a way to kind of contribute to this branch. But there's a long and winding story that suggests that when Allport actually was able to procure an interview with Freud, the interaction between the two of them did not go as was, we'll say, planned. There was a back and forth between the two of them, with Freud supposedly making some suggestions about Allport and his tendencies based on some of the things that Allport was telling Freud. And in the end, it led to Allport leaving the Psychodynamic Institute and deciding that instead of pursuing personality psychology through the lens of Freud, he would go back to the States and try to essentially reinvent what personality psychology was all about. And this brought him back to Harvard, the home of his undergraduate degree, where in just 2 years he was able to get through the coursework and write an amazing book that led to his PhD. And in this book that he wrote, what he tried to do was, as I mentioned, sort of reinvent what personality psychology was all about. His big insistence was that we needed to do away with studying individuals just based on what's happening to them and what occurred in their past that's leading them to where they were, and instead just focus on the ways we can describe people so we can better understand why they're doing some of the things in specific situations. In particular, he really insisted that personality and trait psychology should be highly interrelated with each other, if not really the same thing. And this new idea of trying to approach personality psychology from a scientific perspective, of trying to quantify individual differences and then use that for scientific purposes, has led many individuals to actually call Gordon Allport the first true personality psychologist out there. Because in his work, he really tried to insist that we should do away with studying the obscure or the random personality characteristics that sometimes emerge, and instead focus our attention on the day-to-day individual differences that we see and how those things play a role in our every experience. Something that still resonates with personality psychologists today. But it's important to note here that this transition in personality psychology did not happen overnight. In fact, when Allport presented his ideas to many colleagues on the committee that were considering whether or not he would earn his PhD, he accepted some of his research and his general ideas, but they were strong detractors on whether or not he would ever really pick up much notoriety with this new take on personality psychology. He did, however, get eventually a career at Harvard and continue building in his popularity. And as his popularity grew, this trait idea expanded beyond just let's look at day-to-day individuals and talk about their individual differences. As he expanded his work, started to dabble in how biological mechanisms, both genetics and parts of the brain and nervous system, could potentially be tied to some of the individual differences that he was exploring. He also tried to find ways to quantify what we meant by traits. Are we talking about how often somebody does something that's related to a trait, or how strong a reaction is, or kind of how many situations these things carry into? This led him to introducing terms like frequency and intensity and range in his attempts to try to really pick at what somebody was like and what we needed to know in order to understand what they were going to do in various new and kind of unknown situations. And this idea of Allport's led to a lot of people kind of relating to his concepts, even if they didn't embrace this as the new alternative to personality psychology in the early 1900s. In fact, it took around 20 or 30 years for Allport to grow in popularity. And it might have been because of Allport's insistence that we needed to have this kind of different approach to personality entirely. But there's others that argue that there were other nuances to Allport's work that made it sort of untenable for researchers to embrace and study on the mass scale. One of the things that Allport insisted was that if we wanted to use personality to predict behaviors, we needed to know the personality characteristics that each individual possessed. He suggested that some people might, if we're looking at ways to describe them, just have 3 or 4 different things that make them who they are, while others might have 5 or 10 or 20 things that we need to know about if we want to be able to predict their behaviors in specific situations. He also suggested that even once we know what a person's traits are, we have to understand their perspectives and takes on things to understand how those traits might manifest themselves in different situations. In essence, he was tapping into the fact that people are extremely complex individuals, and if we want to study personality in a scientific way with much utility, we have to take into account those nuances. If we don't, we're just sort of throwing some very imprecise things at a big wall and hoping to see what sticks. It's not necessarily today that people disagree with this insistence of Allport's, but what they have concluded is that if we want to use trait research for large-scale populations, we can't treat each person as this extremely unique thing. We have to find a way to kind of quantify basic essences of personality in individuals so we can study large-scale things like who's going to be successful in a specific school, or what differences do we see among specific groups in terms of personality, or what we sometimes again call traits these days. And this is where we eventually found our way down a path that led us to something called this very popular thing now, the Big Five. It's not that the Big Five is the only way that personality psychologists these days differentiate individuals. In fact, if you take a personality class, you'll learn about very famous researchers like Hans Eysenck, who had these 3 factors that he split people on, and there was another individual named Raymond Cattell, who we'll briefly talk about here, that found ways to classify people on 16 different personality factors. And there's others that were there along the way as we started to try to find a way to kind of simplify in separating out individuals, but also find a universal set of traits to describe them on. But the one most people embrace nowadays is this Big Five, and oddly enough, the path down to the Big Five started with Gordon Allport himself. When Allport was pushed to find a way to kind of simplify the descriptors that we needed to differentiate people and compare them, he concluded that the best way to get that process started was to go to the source. In particular for him, it was the English language. And he said, if we know all the words we can use to describe individuals, well, then we can know how many traits we maybe would need to use to compare one person to another. So Allport had several graduate students, undergraduates, and himself dig through word after word in the English dictionary, and eventually they published a list of about 18,000 words that they said seemed to be indicative of what we would consider traits. For the most part, this is where Allport stopped, surmising that it was going to be almost impossible to get that list down to a manageable number. But there were other trait psychologists a little while later that looked at this list and realized that it was very incomplete. It was one where there were tons of overlaps that didn't necessarily need to be there. This champion of this idea was another individual that I mentioned briefly a little while ago named Raymond Cattell, who decided to go through that list of 18,000 words and look for overlaps, in particular synonyms and antonyms, words that mean the same thing, synonyms, or words that mean exact polar opposite. So, for example, if you came across the words nice and friendly, Cattell argued that nobody would say, I'm nice, but I'm not friendly at all, or I'm friendly, but I'm not nice. We're kind of on the same level for both these things since they mean the same thing. So he said we could do away with, say, friendly in that situation. And if we find the opposite of nice, mean, well, we don't really need both of those if we're measuring somebody in a scale of how nice they are from, say, 1 to 10. Right? Because nobody says, oh, I'm really nice and really mean at the same time, or I'm not nice and I'm not mean. Well, I guess maybe you could be not both if you're right down the middle on it, but you get the gist of what Cattell concluded from this. So when he looked at those 18,000 words with, again, a bunch of graduate students and undergraduates, they came to conclude that most of the words were really redundant and we could get rid of the vast majority of them. In fact, they were able to whittle the list of 18,000 words down to 35 different, what they considered distinct traits, things that didn't on the surface seem to overlap. And that list was tinkered with by several individuals, but eventually there were some mathematicians named Robert Costa and Paul McCrae. Well, they were more personality researchers than anything, but they had some good astute understanding of statistics, who utilized a tool that had been developed a few years prior called the factor analysis on this list of 35 different traits. Essentially, a factor analysis is a very special type of correlation calculation, where we can ask individuals how high or low they are on these traits, the 35 ones, if we're looking at this specific example, and look for very high correlation coefficients between traits. And the idea is if you're very high on one and very high on the other, or very low on one and very low on the other, and it's consistent for pretty much everybody, that even though those two things might seem unique, there seems to be some inherent underlying thing tied to both of them. And this also works for things that are negatively correlated with each other as well. When Costa and McCrae ran a factor analysis by asking a whole large sample of people to fill out where they were on this list of 35 traits, they were able to conclude that, at least in the United States and college-aged people, there seemed to be 5 different factors that emerged from these 35 different traits when people responded to how high or low they were on these characteristics. And these 5 traits that they discovered led to this thing that we now, again, call the Big Five. You might be asking, what is the Big Five? Well, I've actually alluded to the Big Five before. If you recall back to, and I think I did this, I'm blanking actually if I did this or not now, but I'm pretty sure if you recall back to the memory lecture, I've probably made the statement, at least I've done this for many semesters before, that your personality spans the ocean. That word, ocean, actually encapsulates the Big Five within the letters of the word. O stands for openness to experience. C stands for conscientiousness, E stands for extroversion, A stands for agreeableness, and N stands for neuroticism. And like I mentioned before, when people started transitioning to trait research, and in particular trying to find this, what we call parsimonious or simplified way of comparing individuals. They went to the Big Five and said, what we'll do if we want to understand traits and how they affect people is measure everybody on these 5 traits. Either ask coworkers or peers or them or parents, depending on how we're looking at, how high or low they are on not only these factors, but also facets within them, with each of them having 6 facets contained within them. You see those pictured on, well, components of them pictured on the right. These facets within these factors, we would measure how high or low people are on these, and we could use that information to predict how people might behave in specific situations. And the big idea behind the Big Five, which was kind of novel at the time, was that it wasn't really a judgment on people where they lied. It was just a tool we could use to predict how they might react in specific social situations. So, for example, if we look at openness to experience, how curious you are, how much you're open to new ideas and trying novel things. And if you were really high in openness to experience, it didn't mean that you were inherently a good person in comparison to your peers that were lower. It just meant that in social situations where this particular trait manifested itself, well, then you would probably behave in some predictable way. For those that are in the middle, well, they're a little split on this. And those in the bottom end, well, those are the ones that don't necessarily crave novelty, like routine, don't feel this desire to constantly be mentally challenged. Now, obviously, as I'm mentioning this, I'm guessing many of you are starting to impart judgment on individuals who don't maybe fit into the same level as you on this specific trait. But what you have to appreciate is that it's not designed to be an indictment on an individual based on where they are. It's, again, just a descriptor of how they approach specific personality-related situations. And what people using the Big Five have done is tried to find things that where we lie on these traits can correlate with. Researchers have tried to figure out things like which majors you might enjoy more based on how you lie in the Big Five, or which roommates you might get along better with, or how healthy you're going to be in older age based on the prominence of specific traits within you. There's, of course, just a few examples of it, but hopefully from these examples, you can see the utility of the Big Five and why it's become such a popular area of research for those trying to study personality-related concepts. But before we get super excited about the Big Five, I do want to point out that even though this has been embraced by many people in the psychological community, there are detractors for this theory. One of the things that really bothers lots of researchers and people that look at this from a more hypothetical perspective is that even though the means of coming up with the Big Five seem pretty logical, it's also, if you think about it, fairly narrow-minded. What we did to design the Big Five was use the English dictionary and find ways to kind of look for overlaps between things that we thought should overlap with each other. Researchers started to ask, about a decade or two after the Big Five came out, whether or not we'd find the Big Five if we used other languages, and if we had other people, not just academics, trying to whittle things down. And what's kind of interesting to note is that people didn't start to just question this. They started to try to replicate if we could find the Big Five across a wide range of languages and cultures. And what we surprisingly found is that for the most part, in many cultures, the Big Five, the exact traits we talked about, do seem to emerge. But it's not 100%. In our Romance languages, English, Italian, Spanish, usually the Big Five or something very close to it does seem to come up. But if we start going to other groups, other languages that don't necessarily conform into the traditional languages that many of us maybe grew up in, well, then all of a sudden the Big Five starts to morph. Sometimes there are things that merge together. like conscientiousness and agreeableness. Other times, there's things that actually separate out and become their own unique thing. In many cultures that don't, again, conform to what we have in the United States, we see a number of traits that seem to fit under this umbrella concept of religious levels. Now, that's not to say that in the US we're not religious. It's just that we don't have quite as many terms in the English language that relate to this concept. And when we do a factor analysis in ways people describe themselves, it doesn't seem to emerge as a distinct thing. Same thing with humor levels. Creativity levels also kind of tend to be unique things that pop up in other cultures. Again, in some, there's things that collapse. As I mentioned, in many cases, extroversion and agreeableness will sometimes align. In most cultures, the ones that do kind of collapse on each other is extroversion and openness to experience, where our willingness to try new stuff tends to also align with our desire to be around other individuals. In some cultures, actually, three factors collapse into each other: neuroticism, extroversion, and openness to experience, where neuroticism and extroversion are negatively correlated with each other, and neuroticism and openness to experience are also negatively correlated with each other. And this really, again, highlights not only the kind of complexity to the Big Five, but how once it started to become more mainstream, people poked at this new idea of personality psychology in a number of different ways. We also, when looking at it, tried to understand a really critical component to it, and it was sort of the cap that we could have on traits found within the Big Five if we tried to use this for predictive purposes. Unfortunately, it is important to note that even though many personality psychologists do celebrate the Big Five, there is this realization that its ability to predict things is usually pretty limited. Usually a correlation of around 0.3 is the best you can hope for when you're trying to correlate one of these factors within the Big Five with very specific situation-based behaviors. And this has led some to suggest that maybe we don't really want to embrace the Big Five, while it's led others to say, well, it's an important factor that we need to consider. It's just we also have to understand the environment if we want to predict behaviors. In some cases, it's even led others to say maybe the original work that was promoted by Allport had more merit to it, even though it made things more complex. Because if you remember back to the ideas of Allport's, his insistence was that because we're all so unique, we can't use the same traits to kind of compare people and try to predict how people are going to behave in specific situations. But, regardless of where you stand on this idea, it's important to understand these concepts of the strengths and shortcomings of the Big Five and to understand the nuances to it, because if we're looking at our current personality psychology, the Big Five is a very commonly studied topic within the field. And this also has led us to some more kind of surprising areas of focus in the last couple years. Many researchers, oddly enough, when we started to turn our attention to trait psychology, started to approach these traits in similar ways to the way we approached personality for decades before traits became the most prominent thing. As I mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, early trait psychologists tended to focus on what caused us to be unique. Now, most of their focuses were on the kind of really quirky or atypical behaviors that some people displayed. With traits, it wasn't necessarily about the things that made us extremely different from others that we wanted to study, but instead it was what caused people to move in specific directions on the Big Five. And if we're looking for the source of many traits, it's probably important to note that developmental psychologists have played a role in this discussion, and what they've tended to find is that through the sibling studies we've discussed earlier, genes do seem to matter a lot. And we haven't, if you're wondering, found a specific gene that's linked to one of the big 5 traits. We can't pull blood from you and say, ooh, based on your blood, it looks like you're extremely neurotic or not neurotic at all. But, we can find with genetic overlaps, some indicators of what could be tied to specific traits, and that if people are very similar in their genes, their traits tend to overlap a lot. But with these sibling studies, what we've also been able to show is that the environment does matter. In particular, the unique environments that individuals experience, even if they're a part of the same household. One of the things that seems to be a big catalyst as people start to kind of divvy up and become who they are in adolescence are the groups that they start to relate to. And this is something that's led to lots of discussion of another prominent theory in personality psychology called the learning theory of traits, that suggests that as we start to identify ourselves, as we start to identify how we're separate from others, those labels that we give to ourselves tend to eventually segue into the traits that start to become more and more prominent within us. But this learning theory of traits is one that we surmised for a long period of time before we could actually find it. If we're looking at what was a problem with discovering this thing that seemed pretty intuitive, that the groups that we're a part of or the memberships that we're in lead to our personality, we have to understand another cognitive effect that seemed to play a role in this called anchoring effects. In essence, when somebody describes themselves, what the anchoring effect suggests is that we don't describe ourselves based on us compared to everybody in the population. Instead, we use those cliques or groups that we're a part of to get a general gauge of certain aspects of who we are. But then within those groups, we compare ourselves to the members of that group to get a more precise level of what we possess. And this can lead to some faulty conclusions, especially in the extremes. Let's say you're somebody that's in a group of friends that is very, shy, very introverted. And you sort of know that. You know that you're not necessarily the most outgoing group of individuals. But then when you think about how outgoing you are in comparison to your peers, those ones that you hang out with, you might come to the conclusion that you're a little bit more outgoing than some of those people. So even though you're in a group of very shy people, you, for some inexplicable reason, when asked to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 where you are on your shyness level, give yourself something around a 4 over 5. You recognize that your group of friends, the anchor, is relatively shy, but because you're above average for your group of very shy friends, you bump those numbers up considerably. Let's say now, instead, you're a member of a group of individuals that's extremely outgoing, constantly wanting to interact with people, constantly enjoying social situations. But you find yourself not necessarily being the most outgoing person within this extremely outgoing group. Again, you might, for some inexplicable reason, when you're asked to rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 on how outgoing you are, give yourself something like a 6 or a 7 because, well, you're a part of an outgoing group, but you're not quite as outgoing enough. That weird within group comparison is really problematic if we want to truly correlate where we are in certain traits with the groups that we're a part of. Because it creates these wide ranges of scores that people that possess very similar characteristics might provide based on where they happen to lie within their groups and their populations. And it's led, again, to some very challenging data that took a long time to parse out to show that the groups that we were part of, the things that we identified with, did lead to our traits. But once we were able to control for these things by asking people to, compare themselves to the population as a whole, or, and this is a big one, talk about the frequency of how often they did things related to specific traits, Well, then all of a sudden, this learning theory of traits started to become more prominent. And we started to recognize how important, if we're looking at unshared environments, our memberships and our things we identify with are in the emergence of our traits when we start getting into adolescence and adulthood. And this kind of pathway of discovery as to how traits can be tied to specific things, how we can incorporate trait research into things like developmental psychology and other avenues of research, I think is a great place to kind of close out this topic. If we were in the in-person class, there'd be a few more avenues that I would have loved to explore and a few more things that I would think we could do. But for this online format, I think just going through the journey of understanding what trait psychology is about, who championed it a number of decades ago, and how trait psychology has emerged in its current form is a good spot to be at. And hopefully, now that we've done that, we can turn our attention to another very closely related topic, and that's how we quantify personality today. And that's what we'll be doing in our next class, talking about quantification of personality. And afterwards, we'll be transitioning to something very closely related to it in clinical psychology. Now, we're going to be getting into a lot of very interesting, very sensitive topics over these next couple lectures. So if you've found yourself kind of straying away from the book, I really want to stress before we leave that it's a good time to start revisiting it. Start doing those readings in advance of the presentations or right after, and really getting that second voice to have these messages hit home. If you can do that, maybe review this, you should be set as we move on, and I'm hoping I'll see many of you very soon. But for now, as always, take care, and I hope to see you soon.